Kiss is a band that found themselves sharing the stage with a variety of rock talent.
We'll do festivals, and sometimes we'll find ourselves on a bill headlining over all these very hardcore metal bands.
Yet there were bands they outright refused to be seen anywhere close with. And touring with them doesn't mean more tours. Here are 8 bands Kiss refused to tour with and why they did so. Starting our list is band number 8, Metallica. Back in the early 2000s, rock fans dreamed of what could have been one of the biggest tours in metal history, a joint tour between Metallica and Kiss. 2 of the loudest, most theatrical, and most influential bands in rock sharing the same stage. It sounded perfect on paper. But despite the rumors, the teases, and even talks behind the scenes, it never happened. And the reason wasn't some feud, rivalry, or clash of egos. It was something much simpler. Timing. In interviews over the years, both bands have acknowledged that the idea came up more than once. The promoters wanted it, fans demanded it, and even the musicians themselves thought it would be epic. But every time discussions began, scheduling conflicts and creative priorities got in the way. Metallica was always in a different phase of their career. When Kiss was touring, Metallica was in the studio. When Metallica hit the road, Kiss was in the middle of a farewell tour, a reunion tour, or a massive solo project. Their paths never quite aligned, but despite never sharing a full tour, both bands have expressed mutual admiration. Lars Ulrich once said that Metallica respected what Kiss did for rock and roll, calling them pioneers in branding and showmanship. And Gene Simmons, never shy about sharing opinions, praised Metallica for carrying the flag of heavy metal into the mainstream without losing their edge. It was never personal. It was just business, timing, and creative direction. Band number 7, Bob Dylan and his crew. He was the poetic voice of a generation. They were the fire-breathing spectacle of stadium rock. Bob Dylan and Kiss, 2 legends who define music in totally different ways. Bob Dylan, born Robert Zimmerman, starts as the king of folk, poetic, serious, a voice for protest. His songs like Blowin' in the Wind changed the world. But in 1965, Dylan does the unthinkable. He walks onto the Newport stage, plugs in an electric guitar, and completely shocks his fans. It's a massive, fiery betrayal to the acoustic world, and it shows you one thing. Dylan is a master of reinvention, but one thing he never did was compromise on his faith. As much as he loved rock, he never wanted to give the impression that he had deviated from his Christian root. While he was being conservative with his music and style, Kiss were not. The performance theatrics, the makeup, and the overall style was a bit over the top for Dylan and to him, and showed that they weren't only non-Christian, but might possibly be leaning to the opposite side. However, music was music, and despite their differences, the 2 of them actually collaborated. While the public wondered if Dylan hated or loved Kiss, one of them was actually working with him. Yes, the demon himself, Gene Simmons, has a documented songwriting session with the voice of folk. They wrote a song together called Waiting for the Morning Light. The collaboration was real, it was recorded, and it was utterly bizarre. It would take more than just a collaboration for Kiss to buy into Bob Dylan's style. They needed him to embrace the theatrics that came with making songs with them. But Dylan wasn't ready to budge. He had his style, and he wasn't going to compromise it. And he wasn't a rookie rock star either, so he could forgo touring with Kiss if it meant sticking to his authentic self. Band number 6, Carlos Santana and his crew. This man had more in common with Kiss than you would imagine. It all started with a guitar and a dream. Carlos Santana wasn't just another musician in the late 1960s. He was a revelation, a young man from Mexico who brought Latin rhythms into American rock, fusing percussion, blues, and spirituality into something new. His performance at Woodstock in 1969 wasn't just a set, it was a spiritual awakening. His guitar didn't scream. It sang, cried, and lifted people higher. By the time albums like Abraxas and Santana 3 came out, Carlos had already carved his name among the greats. This rise to fame and breath of fresh air he brought to the genre of rock is reminiscent of how Kiss bursted into the rock scene. They were loud and different, and people loved them for this. But truly, Santana and Kiss were on the opposite spectrum of things. While Santana was searching for peace through his music, another storm was forming in a different corner of rock. Kiss, loud, wild, covered in makeup and leather. Where Santana saw music as prayer, Kiss saw it as pure chaos. But the differences didn't just paint a contrast, it divided them. With time, the separation became worse and worse. The first real spark came in 2005, when Carlos spoke his mind in an interview. He said Gene Simmons wasn't a musician but an entertainer, and that Kiss made Las Vegas music. Music for show, not for the soul. The comments spread fast. Fans were shocked. Gene Simmons wasn't amused. To him, that was a direct insult to everything Kiss had built. At first, Gene brushed it off with a polite line, Not everyone likes the same meal, he said, but that calm didn't last. In 2009, Simmons fired back. He told reporters that Santana was boring on stage, that he just stood there looking at his shoes, and that he should get off the stage. That's not a rock concert, Gene said. We'll show you how the big boys do it. While the rock world saw two groups entities that would never share a stage, organizers saw something else. Promoters were apparently trying to make the impossible happen, a joint tour. Santana and Kiss on the same bill. The idea was crazy enough to work. For a short time, it looked like it might actually happen. But behind the scenes, the old wounds were still fresh. Gene Simmons didn't want to share the stage with a man who had called him fake. Meetings were held, plans were drawn up, but it all fell apart. Kiss reportedly refused to go ahead. At number 5, we have Nirvana. When they erupted out of Seattle in the early 90s, they didn't just change music, they detonated it. Grunge was already bubbling underground, but Nevermind turned it into a cultural earthquake. Suddenly, Kurt Cobain was the reluctant voice of a generation. Yet behind the avalanche of fame, the platinum records, and the MTV interviews, Kurt hated what he had become. A commodity. The same system he despised had turned him into its centerpiece, and that contradiction would haunt him till the end. Cobain never wanted to be a rock star. He wanted to be real. To him, authenticity was everything. So when Nirvana's songs like Smells Like Teen Spirit became anthems for teenagers around the world, he didn't feel victorious. He felt trapped. During a Rolling Stone shoot, he wore a t-shirt that read, "Corporate magazines still suck," staring blankly into the camera. This was a small act of rebellion from a man drowning in fame. It was his way of telling the world, I'm in this circus, but I don't belong here. That same disdain stretched toward the bands that loved the circus. And no band embraced spectacle more than Kiss. To Cobain, their world was everything he thought was wrong with rock and roll. To him, it was a cartoonish exaggeration of everything the underground scene had rejected. Kiss represented excess, artifice, and profit. But here's where it gets interesting. While Nirvana mocked commercial rock culture, Kiss actually liked Nirvana. Gene Simmons admired Cobain's raw honesty and how Nirvana had somehow done what most bands only dreamed of, taking punk ethos to the top of the charts. Simmons, always the businessman, even wanted Nirvana on a Kiss tribute album. But after discussions with members of Nirvana's party and their manager, Gene Simmons started having second thoughts. He got to know that what Cobain portrayed to the public was actually deeper than he had initially thought. Gene came to the realization that a tour would have been impossible. It would have been a battle of ideologies, not just music. Kiss built temples of spectacle. Nirvana tore them down. Then came 1994, the year the music stopped. Cobain's death didn't just end Nirvana. It symbolically ended an entire era of rebellion. The man who once mocked fame became its casualty. For Gene Simmons and the rest of Kiss, the idea of ever sharing a tour with Nirvana died with him. Simmons, ever pragmatic, later admitted that while he admired Kurt's impact, he couldn't work with someone who hated the system that fed them. Band number 4 is the loud and ambitious Guns N' Roses. Guns N' Roses were the snarling street poets of Los Angeles. They didn't need makeup or fireworks. They had attitude, sweat, and raw fury. Axl Rose, in one of his early interviews, mentioned that he used to like Kiss. That was the hook. The problem was what came next. He didn't stop there. Axl went on to call out the band for becoming, in his words, a circus act that forgot about the music. Slash echoed the sentiment later, saying he always hated Kiss, calling their theatrics fake and overdone. To Guns N' Roses, Kiss were rock stars playing dress-up. To Kiss, Guns N' Roses were arrogant kids who didn't respect the legacy that made the very stage they stood on possible. Gene Simmons, never one to stay silent, fired back in typical Simmons fashion. In interviews, he called Axl a brilliant singer, but a disaster waiting to happen. He said that if Axl had someone to smack him upside the head, maybe Guns N' Roses wouldn't implode like so many self-destructive rock legends before them. But in the world of rock music, subtle jabs like are never enough to conclude that two bands can never tour with each other. In fact, it does the opposite. Fans start creating imaginary scenarios which fuel the demand for such collaborations. But Guns N' Roses wouldn't be such. When word got back to the Kiss camp that Axl had once again mocked their stage costumes, calling them cartoon superheroes, was the nail in the coffin. Paul Stanley took these statements personally. He had spent years perfecting the Kiss brand. The face paint, the outfits, the larger-than-life image. To have it dismissed by a younger band riding high on MTV and tabloid drama was infuriating. They were the rebels who mocked the establishment, even if that establishment wore leather boots and breathed fire. But it wasn't long before karma came for them. Axl's unpredictable behavior, late shows, and band infighting began to mirror exactly what Gene Simmons had warned about. Kiss watched from a distance as the band that mocked them began to unravel. Guns N' Roses weren't exactly the hotshot they had initially perceived themselves to be, and time was slowly revealing this. Years later, when asked about Guns N' Roses, Gene couldn't resist twisting the knife. He said, "They had everything and threw it away. It was the ultimate 'I told you so.'" But by then, both bands had carved their names into rock history. Kiss continued touring, immortalizing their brand across generations. Guns N' Roses eventually reunited, older, wiser, but still carrying that same fire that once made them the most dangerous band in the world. Band number 3 is Aerosmith. They've actually gone on tour with Kiss before, but things ended so brutally that they could never let history have a chance of repeating itself by touring again. So where did this all start from? In 2003, two of rock's biggest names, Aerosmith and Kiss, announced something that sent shockwaves through the music world. It was the kind of dream lineup that promised fireworks, face paint, and flaming guitars. A co-headlining tour bringing together the kings of theatrical hard rock and America's most enduring blues rock band. Fans called it a once-in-a-lifetime event. Promoters called it the World Domination Tour. When the announcement first dropped, the rock community went wild. Decades of combined hits from Rock and Roll All Night to Dream On, Detroit Rock City, Sweet Emotion, and more, all under one roof. It sounded too good to fail. But there was a catch. Neither band was at the height of their powers anymore. By 2003, both Kiss and Aerosmith were in that strange phase where nostalgia had become part of the business model. Ticket sales were solid, but their relevance was waning. Fans could feel it, and so could the bands. That's why, from day one, people whispered that this wasn't a collaboration born from passion or friendship, but a cash grab. Still, fans didn't care. Stadiums sold out, cities buzzed, the spectacle was coming to town, and everyone wanted a ticket. On paper, it was a co-headlining tour, but the word co-headlining would soon become the fuse to a slow-burning rivalry. Aerosmith insisted on closing every show, refusing to alternate with Kiss. For them, it wasn't negotiable. They saw themselves as the more musically serious band, the real musicians in this pairing. To Kiss's massive fan base, it felt like a slap in the face. The first few nights went smoothly enough, but soon, something started happening. After Kiss's explosive, fire-drenched set complete with flying Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons spitting blood, and pyros lighting up the sky, fans would begin to leave. Thousands of them. People didn't want to wait for Aerosmith. They'd seen their showstopper, their spectacle, their ending. Backstage, Aerosmith's camp was reportedly unimpressed with Kiss's theatrics. Rumors spread that Steven Tyler wouldn't even hang around to watch Kiss play. Meanwhile, things were falling apart within the bands themselves. Kiss was already in the midst of internal chaos. Peter Criss and Ace Frehley's involvement was a hot topic. Fans demanded their presence. But behind the scenes, contracts and money created friction. And yet, for all its chaos, the World Domination Tour still did what it was meant to. It made money. The grosses were huge. But the spirit was gone. By the final leg, both bands were just finishing the job. They weren't collaborating, they were coexisting. Every city was another paycheck, another night of pretending that everything was fine. Looking back now, it's easy to see why the 2003 Kiss and Aerosmith tour is remembered less as a rock milestone and more as a cautionary tale. Number 2. Motley Crue. It would seem now that Kiss would rather chew on broken glass than have a joint tour with Motley Crue right now. That wasn't always the case. The year 1983 was a critical year for both Motley Crue and Kiss. By this time, Kiss had become a household name while Motley Crue were still trying to get their big break. The crew, consisting of Nikki Sixx, Vince Neil, Tommy Lee, and Mick Mars, was not yet a global superstar, but they were a local LA phenomenon. Their debut album, Too Fast for Love, was a hit on the Sunset Strip, so although they weren't there yet, they were definitely on the right path to it. With the release of Kiss's Creatures of the Night album, a tour was bound to follow. But as big as they were, they knew that they couldn't do it alone. And who better than to open for them than the newbies making waves? Motley Crue would get exposure, and Kiss would get the energy of a young crew to open for them. But although things ended on a good note between the two bands, things would start to sour between them. And the first instance of this would follow after the tragic passing of Robin Williams. Gene Simmons reportedly said this about depressed and suicidal individuals. "No, I don't get along with anybody who's a drug addict and has a dark cloud over their head and sees themselves as a victim. Drug addicts and alcoholics are always "The world is a harsh place." As you would imagine, this comment left the rock world as well as the entertainment industry shocked. How could someone so revered say something so insensitive? But nobody was more hurt than Nikki Sixx. His response to this was nothing short of disappointing. "I came from a messed up situation, not unlike a lot of people. There are almost 15 million Americans who are depressed. Gene Simmons says I should have just killed myself. 15 million people should just kill themselves. To be honest with you, I like Gene, but in this situation, I don't like Gene. I don't like Gene's words. But these were just light words. It was never anything to really cause a rift. Gene Simmons knew how polarizing his take was, so he wasn't bothered about what Nikki had to say. But when he did it, was because he had made a claim too absurd to believe he actually would. Those custom-built, gigantic arms that crew developed. These stage elements would hide in the ceiling until the grand finale, when Sixx and Vince Neil would jump on for a massive, soaring ride out over the arena crowd. According to SixX, he saw footage of Kiss using the exact same thing. Sixx didn't hold back, saying that seeing the repeat performance of their hard-won, unique idea just bothers me, especially since it was such a major part of Motley Crue's farewell. These words weren't born from rage, but they also burnt a bridge of collaborations. Kiss no longer saw the Motley Crue younger brothers that opened for them all those years back. So when the End of the Road World Tour came around, Kiss had no room for bands that were old friends but had turned into enemies, and that included Motley Crue. And finally, band number 1. As shocking as this may be, it's actually Kiss themselves. Now here's the crazy thing about Kiss. They have had so many members leave and get replaced that no generation of fans truly witnessed the same roster as perhaps a younger or older generation. The two artists who started Kiss are Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, and they were the most consistent members of the team because they had up to 5 new members replace old ones by the early 2000s, but they were there through it all. The first person that left the group was Catman, the first Catman, Peter Criss, who left Kiss in 1980. Not only was his substance abuse wrecking the team, but Kiss discovered that their drummer was intentionally jeopardizing their performances and making them look bad. That's when they brought in Eric Carr to replace him, but that wouldn't be the last time Kiss would have to let one of their band members go. Less than 2 years later, Ace Frehley felt then that leaving would be the best thing he could do for himself. He felt Kiss was holding him back, and he wanted to go solo. He did get his way, but the cost was his former band being a man short. But there would always be someone to fill in the empty spots. And Vinnie Vincent was that guy. C and Peter had been in and out of Kiss many times. Gene and Paul say the main reason was that Ace and Peter were often unreliable because of personal issues like drugs and alcohol. They claim they tried to bring them back 3 times, but it never worked out long term. Gene has publicly stated that they offered Ace and Peter a chance to play a song or two during the final shows, maybe for the encore. But guess what? The other two said no. Ace and Peter felt Gene and Paul didn't offer a real invitation. They suggested the offer was just for show, a way to make fans happy without actually paying them what they felt they deserved. Ace, for his part, made it clear he wanted to be paid well, like a lot of money, to play the final shows. He said, "If I get a formal invitation with a check, I'll be there." So, was the invite just talk? Or was the asking price just too high? Gene and Paul had already sold out the tour without them, so they didn't need them to make money. Or did they? The rest of Kiss saw that Ace and Peter wouldn't want to get back with the band without a financial compensation. To them, this screamed that their heart wasn't in this. They were just in to fatten their pockets. They were no longer in Kiss for a reason, and the real members of Kiss had a good reason not to let them tour. There you have it, 8 bands that Kiss flat out refused to tour with. Do you think their reasons for not sharing a stage with some of these bands is legitimate? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more videos like this.